Sipping martinis under the skyline, and watching the leather still walk on by. Feeling small, now I'm cutting ties. I'm dreaming of the big sky. I don't know where we are going to, and who knows where we might have been. If I left you back in Brewtown, would your life be better spent? Chugging a micro,
hit.
nothing there.
That's a good fish.
Wearing these
That's a good
cards
fish,
and
Rick.
fleece underwear.
Let's get into this, Eddie.
Feeling tall on this little stage. You're missing your family, they're so far away.
Nice.
I don't know where we are going to, and who knows.
Hi, my name is Resto Brzezinski. I am a fishing outfitter for Montana Dream Fishing Outfitters here in Helena, Montana. And I want to welcome you to the Introduction to Fly Fishing class. I decided to do these classes, to hold these online classes, because I think right now is a great time for people to learn how to fly fish. I mean, it gives you an opportunity to get outside, spend some time with family members during this whole Corona or COVID-19 thing. You can go outside and have fun and socially distance yourself. We out here in Montana don't have our trips have kind of suffered a little bit, so I have time to put these classes together, and hopefully you guys get something out of it. Hopefully you enjoy it. So fly fishing, I grew up in Minnesota, and I was always hunting and fishing when I was a kid, but never really got into fly fishing until I moved out to Montana. And it something definitely clicked for me, because fly fishing is so interactive, and fly fishing is so much of a challenge, and you're constantly doing stuff. I kind of got bored with traditional or other means of fishing, because to me it kind of got boring. So when I moved out to Montana and was introduced to it, that was probably 2001. It completely changed my life, and now this is what I do. I fly fish. That's my job, it's my career, it's my passion, and I want to share that. I want to share that with you guys. There's the whole process of learning to fly fish can be really intimidating. I understand that. I remember when I was getting into it, I remember going to a fly shop and having a really kind of a discouraging experience. The person in the fly shop wasn't real helpful, kind of looked down on me or down at me for not knowing anything about fly fishing, and it really it frustrated me. It kind of turned me away from fly fishing for a little bit, and I find that with fly fishing a little bit is that there's kind of this pompous attitude to it, and it doesn't have to be that way. I went into another fly shop a few weeks after that, and I had a completely different experience. The shop owner of that fly shop here in Helena, he sat down with me, taught me how to tie knots and some of the basics to just rigging up a fly rod. But in a couple hours or even an hour, I mean, I learned a lot from him, but there's only so much you can learn in an hour or so. So what I'm trying to do is give you guys a base set of knowledge so that you can go into fly shops and go out on the river and figure some of the stuff out for yourself. But then we're going to do a deep dive into fly fishing, and we're gonna really tear the whole sport of fly fishing apart and get real specific on a lot of different things. Throughout the these courses that I'm going to post online, we're going to talk about things like gear. Gear is incredibly important. We're going to talk about casting. We're going to talk about presentation. We're going to talk about entomology, reading water, line management and landing fish. We're going to talk about conservation, a little bit about the philosophies of fly fishing and how that can impact your life. I understand that that can be cheesy, but there's some lessons to learn through fly fishing, and then we're also going to talk about planning trips. So that's what I hope to give you guys. If you choose to participate in these classes, I'm going to hopefully help you guys out on this journey. It's a journey of living this lifetime activity of fly fishing. Fly fishing can be that thing for you. It can be this lifelong pursuit of just mastering something, and mastering something pretty cool. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm putting the introductory class together, and what you can expect to, or us to talk about today, is the difference between fly fishing and other forms of fishing like spin fishing or bait fishing, and why that's important. Like, what is fly fishing? We're going to talk about what fly fishing is, and that will help formulate some goals and an understanding of some of the techniques to fly fishing. We're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of fish that you can target. We're going to talk briefly about techniques of fly fishing. There's streamer fishing, nymph fishing, dry fly fishing, and swinging soft hackles. We're gonna talk about that stuff. And as we do that, I'm also going to introduce you to some of the basic entomology and why these techniques have been formulated or developed over time, and what you're trying to do with those techniques. What type of food are you trying to mimic with those techniques? So talk briefly about entomology, and then we're going to talk about different types of water that you can fish, different types of streams, and why that's important, because knowing the different kinds of streams, you're going to also build an understanding of what food is in the water and how to go after those fish that are in those specific types of water. And then finally, we're going to put all of this into perspective and talk a little bit about the philosophy behind fly fishing, and hopefully the goals that you might develop while learning how to fly fish. All right, so where do you start? And that's a really important question. Like, where to begin in this journey of learning how to fly fish? I think first of all, you have to have an understanding of what fly fishing is, and to some point what it isn't. And how we're going to frame that is talk about where fly fishing came from. The theory is, or it came from, a couple thousand years ago. The Romans were tying natural fibers around hooks, and those natural fibers could have been the undercoat of certain animals that have dubbing in their fur, and then there's feathers from birds that were wrapped around hooks. Deer hair or other animal hair could be pulled out to make it look like wing patterns of flies. Essentially, what it comes down to is taking natural fibers and wrapping it around a hook in order to present to a fish what would be their natural food. This is what the Romans were doing a couple thousand years ago, and through visitors from Europe trading with the Middle East, they brought this form of fishing back to Europe with them. And in somewhere in about the 19th century, it had developed in Europe into a kind of a rich person's or rich man's sport. And that's really unfortunate because it's carried with the sport that kind of rich man moniker or kind of this snobbiness for a couple centuries now. And even today there is some of that. Now, it's definitely, there are ways to go about fly fishing that are not that expensive, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit in future lessons. We're going to talk about gear and how you can purchase gear so it's not that expensive. The other thing I would say is that we certainly have a lot of women that are in the sport today that enjoy fly fishing. We have women guides out here, which I think is awesome. So there is this, it is changing. It's not just a rich man sport anymore. Certainly a lot of women involved, and like I said, you can get into it without breaking the bank. So how is it different from other forms of fishing? Like I said, it's taking natural materials to basically mimic natural food. Where spin fishing is more about triggering a response from a fish. When you throw a spinner out in the water and you crank it back as fast as you can, that spinner is creating flash, which appeals to a visual sense from a fish, and it also creates some vibration that triggers a response by it hits the lateral lines on a fish, and that fish has to respond, and a lot of times it attacks the spinner. There are other crankbaits that do similar things that have noise to them or flash to them. There is some of that, like they're trying to replicate natural food, but a lot of it is just is triggering a different sense and different from what we're trying to do with fly fishing. With fly fishing, we're actually trying to present something that represents their natural food. Trout eat bugs, and that's what we're trying to do is create patterns of flies that look like their actual food and then present it so that they eat it. Bait fishing, obviously the difference there is you're using actual food that a fish might eat, like worms or leeches or minnows that have smell and taste. So there's obvious differences there. Now, the whole thing about natural materials to tie flies. Now, there's certainly some debate over what materials ought to be used in tying flies. Those materials have evolved over the years, and we do use a lot of synthetics. We use a lot of flash. It's tied on a metal hook, so it's not necessarily all natural materials anymore. But it certainly gets to the essence of what fly fishing is, and that in creating those flies and presenting those flies naturally. There are purists out there, and this kind of gets into the philosophy of fly fishing. There are certainly purists out there that believe that you should only tie dry flies, you should only tie with natural materials, and they're on this end of a continuum of purists versus the more novice or even pragmatic anglers, where they will use synthetic materials and they might tie a fly that looks like a worm. A purist over here might consider that cheating. They might say that the only real form of fly fishing is dry fly fishing. So in this continuum, or along this line, you guys are eventually going to find yourself somewhere. And as you learn more and more and more about fly fishing and you become better at it, you also might move along that continuum and decide that you want to fish a more, challenge yourself a little bit more and fish certain techniques that maybe because they're more of a challenge, you might decide that that's your jam. But what I hope you don't do is, in that process, look back at people that are on this other end of the continuum and look down on them, because we all have our thing. We all have our skill levels. We all have our starting point. And we're all on this journey, and we're not necessarily on the journey together. It's our own. We get our own pleasure out of it, and just keep that in mind when you're learning more skills and you're becoming more technical. We're all trying to have fun. All right, let's talk about just types of fish that we can go after while fly fishing. And the reason this is important is because there are so many opportunities out there. You might find that trout fishing in the Rockies is your thing. You might find bass fishing in Minnesota is your thing. You might fish saltwater on the flats. There's plenty of opportunities to catch bonefish, tarpon, permit. And depending upon where you live, those opportunities may be there for you, and that might determine, what type of fish you want to go after, and with that, you will then start building your gear and purchasing gear around those types of fish and those environments that you're going to be fishing. Now, for the sake of what we're doing here, yes, there is saltwater fishing out there. There is warm water species, for instance, like bass and northern pike, those kinds of things in the lakes in certainly in the Midwest, but across the country, lakes and rivers. And then what we do out here is more cold water species. We fish for trout mostly. Trout are a cold water species, and they thrive in the Rockies because the water is clean and cold, and it's a great habitat for them. So that's what we're going to be talking about when I'm teaching fly fishing skills. I'm coming at it with this idea or this framework of cold water species in streams, typically in the Rocky Mountains. But that doesn't mean that those skills that I'm going to be teaching can't also work in where you're from, whether it be saltwater or warm water species. You certainly can take these basic techniques to your home waters and be successful. So keep that in mind. Let's talk basic techniques for fly fishing. Now, in the upcoming lessons, we're going to get really specific and deep into these different techniques. But what I want to do right now in this introductory lesson is to explain a little bit about what these techniques, these main 4 techniques for fly fishing are. The first technique we're going to talk about is streamer fishing, and then we have nymph fishing, and then dry fly fishing, and then there is this technique of swinging soft hackles that we're also going to talk a little bit about. Streamer fishing. So streamer fishing is the most like spinner fishing. It's taking a generally it's a big fly, and it has material tied to that hook that when it's in the water and it's moving, it's supposed to replicate either a bait fish or a crayfish or some sculpin or even trout fry. And what a person does when they're streamer fishing is a couple things. They can throw the streamer against the bank and strip it away from the bank and make it look like a swimming minnow or another fish or crayfish or whatever that food source is. And the idea is to present it in front of a trout who is a more predaceous kind of trout. Brown trout get that, kind of get that stigma of eating other fish. So that's kind of what you're going after. Although rainbow trout eat the streamers, brown trout, cutthroats, they all eat streamers. You can catch all of those species on a streamer. You're basically presenting a fly that looks like that type of food source that is going to be swimming away from a fish and triggers a response from that fish to eat that minnow or leech or crayfish before it gets away. You can also swing streamers, and what you would do is cast downstream and then let that, as you're facing downstream, you just let that streamer swing down downstream from you, and it just kind of waves in the current, and that can be really effective too. Now it's way more technical than that, and we will talk more about that when the time comes. Nymph fishing. Now, in order to understand what nymph fishing is, you have to understand what a nymph is, and this is where we start bringing entomology into the discussion. A nymph is basically the baby stage of a fly, an aquatic fly that hatches out of the water. So you have these nymphs that live either in the silt or attach themselves to rocks, and they're waiting to develop, and then waiting for the right conditions, and then they swim up. Some of them swim up, some of them crawl out onto rocks, some of them just float up to the surface. And as they do that, they become really vulnerable to fish. And it's about 80% of a trout's diet is that subsurface nymph that has yet to come up to the surface of the water and hatch into an adult fly. That's kind of the introduction to the life cycle of an aquatic fly or a species of fly. But nymph fishing, when we're talking about it in the term or in the fly fishing world, it doesn't necessarily have to be a nymph. It could be a scud. It could be a sow bug. It could be even a worm pattern that we're allowing to drift downstream, and we're presenting it naturally as a food source to a trout. So when we're talking entomology, a nymph means like that first stage of a fly, an aquatic fly. When we're talking about it in terms of like a fly fishing, it could be a nymph, but it also could be a lot of other things that we would present as if it was drifting along through the water column. A lot of times what happens, especially in the spring, is high water will knock banks down. What that does is that brings food into the water, like worms and sow bugs and stuff like that. So nymph fishing can be all of those things. It's basically just the way it's being presented. And then we have dry fly fishing. Dry fly fishing is kind of what everybody envisions when they, when they first start fly fishing or even thinking about fly fishing. They're thinking about that puffy fly that sits on top of the water, and what that fly is doing is it's mimicking an adult fly. Once that nymph comes up to the surface, then it stays on the surface for a little while, and again it's vulnerable to fish. As it's floating downstream, dry fly fishing, that's what you're doing, is you're trying to mimic or replicate that adult fly, or that fly that's hatched and sitting on top of the surface. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's only those aquatic bugs that we're going to be fishing with when we dry fly fish. There are terrestrials as well. Terrestrials are just bugs that aren't born in the water, like hoppers, grasshoppers, crickets, ants, beetles, those kinds of things that can get blown into the water and that, again, float downstream on top of the water and become vulnerable to fish. It becomes fish food. So those things are also considered dry flies and dry fly fishing. Again, when we get really deep into the entomology and we start talking more about the specific types of flies, you are going to learn a ton about the life cycle of all these things, all these critters that the fish will eat, and how to present that, and even how to tie a fly that represents those food sources. And the last technique for fly fishing that we'll talk about is swinging soft hackles. Similar to what I said about streamers, where you could cast and let it swing downstream from you, you could present a streamer that way. You can also present nymphs that way. So some nymphs hatch out of riffles and rocks on the bottom, and they swim up to the surface. And when they swim up to the surface, they're actually moving pretty quick. So what we're trying to do when we're swinging soft hackles is to represent that swimming nymph. Okay? So as that nymph is swimming to the surface, or as we're drifting and then swinging our line downstream, that nymph actually comes up, and the way it's tied, it kind of looks like it's kicking a little bit, and it's got some motion to it. And that's essentially what you're doing when you're swinging soft hackles, is you're representing a fly or a nymph as if it was swimming up to the surface. And it can be really effective. It's not the most there's some technique to it that is a little tricky for people, and it's not the most popular technique out there. In fact, I would say that it's one of the least popular techniques out there, because people either lack the understanding or it's just really tricky to present that fly that way. And when a fish eats that fly, a lot of times you're tight on your fly line and you don't land a whole lot of fish that way. There's some nuance to it that I think people just kind of stay away from, but it can be a really effective means of catching fish. All right, it's probably a good time to talk about the types of water that you're going to be fly fishing in, because what that's going to do is determine what kind of bug life there is in the water. It's going to determine the types of the kind of gear that you buy for those particular streams. And when you're planning a trip, you can kind of figure out what to expect when you're going to be fishing. Based on the types of waters that maybe you hire a guide or you hire an outfitter, and they fish a particular stream or fish certain streams in that area. Then you know what to expect before you even get out here, a little bit anyway. The three major types of streams are the freestones, there are spring creeks, and there are tailwaters, and then of course there are lakes. Let's talk about freestones first. The freestones are, if you think of freestone, it's a pretty good description of what those rivers are. They're usually mountain streams that are fed by runoff, snow runoff, and rain and that. But they're generally coming out of a mountain, and they're unregulated by dams. What some of the characteristics of those streams are, the water levels can fluctuate a lot based on that snowpack or snow melt and any storms that you might get. Generally speaking, there's not as many fish in a freestone, and the bug life is, there's bugs there obviously, but those bugs generally tend to be bigger. There's more stone flies and those kinds of things in freestones, and fish can be a lot more opportunistic. So not as technical of fly fishing, however it is fly fishing, and fly fishing is usually fairly technical by nature. So bigger bugs, smaller fish, not as many fish, but more opportunistic, and then lots of structure. Freestone, generally thinking about boulders and structure that's easy to read. So when you're reading the water, it's kind of obvious where those fish are going to be. So very much a less technical environment to fly fish. So then we have spring creeks. Spring creeks are generally they're those smaller creeks that meander through meadows. They're spring fed, so those springs, it's underground water that supplies water to these creeks. So you can imagine that it's going to be cold water. It's not going to fluctuate as much as like a freestone as far as the level of water or the temperatures. They don't fluctuate nearly as much as a freestone might. The bugs in a spring creek, there's usually a fair number of bugs, but usually smaller bugs, tiny bugs, and fish can grow really large in a spring creek. There's not a ton of fish in spring creeks usually, but they can grow pretty big because of the bug life. Generally speaking, a really technical creek to fish, because flat, really clear water, and any shadow, because it's such a small creek, any shadow that you cast across that water is going to spook fish. So fish get really, really spooky in spring creeks. Real technical fishing. And then we have tailwaters. So a tailwater is basically the water that's coming out of a dam. So you'd have a reservoir above a dam, and then that reservoir supplies the water for that tailwater. Tailwaters can be quite large at times, and the conditions, because of that dam, the conditions are perfect for bug life. Tons of bugs in tailwaters, generally speaking. Because of the bugs, there's usually a lot of fish, and they're usually they can grow really big because of all of that food. Now, tailwaters generally, like I said, they're kind of large, usually pretty flat, relatively slow moving, so the bug, or fish get a long time to look at your flies, and there's so many bugs in the water that fish can be really selective. So big fish, lots of bugs, fish can be really selective. The water temperatures usually don't fluctuate quite as much, and then the level of the water doesn't fluctuate as much either because it's regulated by a dam. Now those are, in general, that's kind of what we're talking about as far as the freestones, spring creeks, and tailwaters. All right, so that's lesson one in a nutshell. What we talked about was we talked about different techniques of fly fishing. We talked about where fly fishing, came from. We talked about different streams, what kind of streams you'll be fishing. We talked about different species that you'll be going after. Now, I just kind of want to wrap it up by offering some perspective. Like I said before, fly fishing, hopefully you really get into fly fishing and it becomes this journey for you. It's something that you could kind of make a parallel to martial arts, right? Everybody starts off with either no skills or just a real base level set of skills, and then they're constantly adding tools, or in martial arts they might add moves or different kicks, different proficiencies. They add this to their toolbox or their tackle box. You might say it's a tackle box, right? So each time they add something to that repertoire or that tackle box, they might get a belt, a different colored belt. In fly fishing, we don't necessarily hand out belts, but what we do is we offer different skills and techniques that you can add to your tackle box. And as you add more and more of those skills to your tackle box, you will find that you'll become exponentially better at fly fishing. Fly fishing will become, you'll start catching more fish. You'll have more fun at it because it won't be nearly as frustrating. But then, like I said earlier, you might start challenging yourself even more to learn more about your prey, to learn more about technique, to be a better caster, to do all of these things, to be more proficient at it, and accomplish different skill levels. And hopefully you become obsessed with it, and you follow that path, or you take that journey, because like I said, it can be a lifelong journey that not only you are going on, but at some point you become so proficient at it that you can then teach other people. You can teach your son or daughter, you could teach your spouse, and it becomes a great bonding exercise with a family member. It could be like kids come out here all the time with their parents, and they plan these trips for all year just to come out here together to spend a week in a cabin and go fishing. It's a great activity. What I hope you get out of fly fishing isn't so much like how many fish I can catch, or who catches the biggest fish, because all of these things are individual. Like it depends on the individual and what their goal is and what they want to get out of fly fishing. For some people, it's casting, to that one rising fish that's just hanging up right under the willows and getting that perfect cast and that perfect drift to catch that one fish. And they might go all day to catch that one fish, and then that's their success. For some people, it is numbers, posting things on Facebook, and hopefully it doesn't become that. Hopefully it's not this means for bragging, because I feel like fly fishing is so much more than that. It's being able to get out in nature, to be able to experience wildlife. It's that whole process of learning about your prey, about having this intimate relationship with what you're going after, like figuring that trout out and really focusing in on where that trout lives and how am I going to trick that fish into eating my fly. It's also about fishing in solitude, having some peace and quiet, and being able to maybe share that with a family member or by yourself. It's about planning these trips. Like, that's part of the process too, is getting excited about being able to see your friends maybe that you hadn't seen for since the last trip. All of these things are a huge part of what fly fishing is, and I feel like what it ought to be. There's this perception of fly fishing as being an art form, and this kind of drives home this whole point of like this individual experience and what people want to get out of it. What does it mean to be an art form? And I think when I watch movies like A River Runs Through It, it's about the casting, right? It's about this beautiful motion, and that is art, right? I mean, that one can interpret it that way. But a few years ago, I had a client. We were talking about this, and she was describing that art form, or how it's designated as an art form. It's because it's less a science and more about the arts of interpretation. It's about the realization that not everyone casts the same way. Not everybody interprets a fly the same way or ties a fly the same way. Not everybody reads water the same way. Not everybody, there's no one hard fast rule to fly fishing. It's not a science, it's an art. And what I hope to do for you through these classes is to provide some tools for you to then go out and developing your own style of doing things and figuring some of these things out for yourself. And then that it becomes a very personalized and an incredibly rewarding venture. And in that, I hope that you guys challenge yourselves to not just go out there and catch 30 fish and then have that be the end. Hopefully it's about challenging yourself to get better at a different technique and to take this journey and to share that journey with your friends. That's all I have for this first lesson. My name is Rusto Brzezinski. Again, it's Montana Dream Fishing Outfitters here in Helena, Montana. We fish the Missouri River. We fish the Blackfoot. Some of the small streams around here that we can walk and wade fish. So if you get into this and you feel like man, that would be a lot of fun to take a trip, go ahead and give me a call. My number is 406-403-8163. Again, it's Rusto Brzezinski with Montana Dream Fishing Outfitters at 406-403-8163. And the website is mdfishingoutfitters.com. You can get on my website and click a button and send me an email and ask for more information. I would love to get you guys out here and maybe give you some more one-on-one instruction, just the two of us, or bring a friend. You can definitely make that happen. If you don't decide to take a trip, I think that's great too. Hopefully you learn enough from these classes to where you can come on out and you can try to figure it out for yourself, and you can have some success doing that. I think that would be awesome. If you do that, give me a call, send me an email. maybe say hello. Maybe we go out to a brewery in town here and have a beer together. That would be great.
We're sipping martinis under the skyline and watching the leather walk on by. Feeling small, now I'm cutting ties. We're dreaming of the big sky. I don't know where we are going to, and who knows where we might have been. If I left you back in Brewtown, would your life be better spent?